Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 8 of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. I'm your host for today, Mark Maharaj. The roundtable discussion with Dana Wells, the friendly antinatalist, has been rescheduled until the next episode. In today's show, I sat down to interview transhumanist philosopher David Pearce to discuss his views on antinatalism, transhumanism, and other related topics. Thank you to everyone in the antinatalist community that submitted questions. Hope you enjoy. Have you listened to any of the episodes yet?
I have. Well, I was just starting to listen to David Benatar before now.
Okay.
And he was, but I haven't. I mean, I'll be honest. You see, that although I am an antinatalist, I don't go around with an antinatalist T-shirt. I have been surprised and impressed by the growth of the antinatalist movement, but it's not something I'd previously closely identified with, in spite of being a native utilitarian. So
actually, I found out about you. Oh, by the way, thank you for being on the podcast, by the way.
No, thank you, Mark.
We've been social media friends for years, and this is the first time that we actually sit down and get to talk to you. So it's really nice. So thank you for doing that. So I found out about you through trying to through the vegan movement. So I was questioning my own ethics, and I really leaned toward the negative utilitarian point of view. And when I was trying to look at vegan negative utilitarians, I found you. And that's how I found out about more of your work through transhumanism. And I got interested in that because even though I identify as an antinatalist, I still want to strive for reducing suffering in all possible ways that we can. And I got into the effective altruism movement as well through there. And then I saw your posts on antinatalism. So I was like, wow, there's a lot of things we agree on. But yeah, I think I was surprised by your posts on antinatalism because, as you said, you don't really carry the card around calling yourself that. So how would you self-describe as a soft antinatalist? Because I believe you used those words before.
Yeah, so it's a distinction between soft and hard. Soft sounds somehow weak-minded, but my problem with hard extinctionist antinatalism is sadly I just don't see how it's going to work. It's the very nature of selection pressure that if we're going to get rid of suffering, I think we're going to have to tackle its biological genetic roots, that simply choosing not to have children and encouraging others to do likewise, even though I do it, nonetheless, in some sense, what one is doing, one is creating selection, intensifying selection pressure against any predisposition not to have kids. And yes, the very nature of selection pressure is such that any predisposition to go forth and multiply is going to be heavily selected for. I mean, in spite of the fact that, yes, most people in the course of a lifetime do sometimes undergo terrible suffering, nonetheless, most people are determined to breed. Religious people tend to outbreed atheists and secular folk by a landslide. And so, yes, back to your question, I describe myself as a soft antinatalist. I don't think one is ethically entitled to bring more suffering into the world. Nonetheless, I think the future belongs to fanatical life lovers. And although I do think human extinction is going to happen, I don't see this as happening via universal childlessness, which is sociologically unrealistic, but instead us essentially rewriting our genetic source code. I mean, we're already seeing the first, very controversially, designer babies in China. Now, the fellow in question was almost certainly trying to do it not to prevent HIV, which was the nominal pretext for what he was doing, but essentially to create intelligent babies, because non-human animals who have the particular mutation in question he was engineering are actually smarter, improved cognition, memory, compared to to mice that lack the mutation. And this wasn't innocence. He knew what he was doing. But rather than focusing on boosting intelligence, which is all very well and much harder, I think we should be, this is it. If you have two people who are determined to have kids, as most people are, essentially, I think was as an obligation to load the genetic dice in their favour. And we already know that it's possible with even a handful of genetic tweaks to radically reduce the burden of suffering in individuals and indeed throughout the living world.
So do you feel that these are, I feel like I'm in alignment with you, and I think Benatar mentioned this too. He doesn't believe that it's going to be a universal thing for antinatalism, but for the select few that happen to not breed, this is a good thing. And isn't this, I don't know, is it not counterproductive to antinatalism to advocate for it if it helps the selection pressure for the life lovers?
Well, this is there's a tension. As I said, personally, I just don't see any way to justify bringing more suffering into the world. And yet, at the same, but it's not a global solution. I think antinatalists in general provide a very valuable service in the sense that they remind people, remind prospective or would-be prospective parents just what a momentous decision they're taking and how they are, and in some sense, knowingly creating more suffering. They won't conceive of it for the most part like that, but in that sense, I think the antinatalist movement is valuable. But when antinatalism shades into human extinctionism or sort of Benatarianism, then, as I said, I have more problems. I mean, most transhumanists, though I myself as a transhumanist, are optimists worrying about existential risk. As we know, there are institutes for prevention of existential risk. Most people, as soon as they hear the word antinatalism, still switch off. Which is why, in a sense, I wear several hats: soft antinatalist, transhumanist, effective altruist. But potentially, I think it's possible to work together, because even if one is, let's say, a hard extinctionist antinatalist, why would it be good if there weren't any sentient beings? Because no sentience means no suffering. But if one takes the view of suffering focused ethics without being a hardline human extinctionist, it's possible to work with a broad coalition of other political social groups. Sort of 20, 30 years ago, we couldn't have this discussion, but technically speaking, now one could have a 100-year plan to phase out the biology of suffering, to genetically reprogram the biosphere. One can actually point to specific genes. The one I most commonly use because it's convenient is SCN9A. Nonsense mutations, you have no capacity to experience pain, but that tends to be problematic, especially in males, because they take all kinds of risk. But SCN9A is a kind of volume knob for pain. And you've got a choice. You can either choose not to have kids at all or to adopt, or if you are going to have children, you can actually choose the level of pain sensitivity of your future kid. Now, most parents will not want to have a child without any capacity to feel physical pain at all, which is indeed dangerous. But nonetheless, it's possible to choose one of the benign alleles of SCN9A, such that your child is, let's say, in the 0.1% genetic outliers. If you've ever met the kind of person who says, "Oh, pain, it's just a useful signaling mechanism," and so on, i.e. they still have the function of nociception, but pain is relatively negligible for them. Now, psychological pain is more complicated, but even here one can point to particular genes and variations, such as if you choose them, you are massively loading the genetic dice in favor of your future children. Now, I'm aware there's a tension here between saying I don't think that you should be bringing more Darwinian malware into the world that will suffer, and at the same time trying to bang the drum for this kind of biohappiness revolution. But as I said, it's important to consider not merely what is technically feasible, but also what is sociologically realistic. Because after all, Gautama Buddha, 2,500 years ago, why didn't he tell his followers, just stop having children? Probably because he would just recognize that it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I feel comfortable being in both camps, because I think it's, listeners may be disappointed to hear this, but I think it's unrealistic to think that everybody's going to adopt not breeding. So if you accept that there's going to be a certain amount of people that will, then you want them to have good lives. And I think we should strive for future people. And so, yeah, I think the existential risk stuff in terms of quality of life matters. And I think both the transhumanist and effective altruist movements work towards that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
What is transhumanism, and what is the what was the project called again? The abolitionist
project.
the abolitionist project. And how do you differentiate, or how do you differ from other transhumanists in your philosophy? If you could summarize some of that.
Yeah, transhumanism is a very broad church, but may crudely be divided into the three supers. Transhumanists would like to see a civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness for all sentient beings. Super intelligence, what do we mean by super intelligence? Cue for a whole bunch of different stories, but this is the idea that it's going to be possible to radically augment our cognitive capacities with the help of AI, genetic engineering, and a host of interventions like that. And yeah, there are different forms of superintelligence, ranging from people who think that humans are going to be replaced by our smart machines, to Kurzweilians who think we're going to merge with AI or perhaps mind uploading. But there's also a stream of a current of biological transhumanists who think post-human superintelligence will be us, genetically rewritten, augmented by AI and AI implants and so forth, but essentially
that's your position, right?
That is my position. I think classical digital computers are zombies, and in one sense they are invincibly ignorant, even though they can slaughter us at chess, Go, and outperform us in countless other cognitive domains. But nonetheless, I don't think they're capable of phenomenal binding. They're not subjects of experience. They don't understand consciousnness or the pleasure-pain axis. But this is a minority position amongst transhumanists, I should say. But this is my position. So that's one strand of transhumanism: the superintelligence. Super longevity. This is the idea that just as we can replace silicon robots, the components, upgrade them indefinitely, likewise, ultimately, organic robots, humans, it'll be possible to phase out the biology of aging. And unlike getting rid of suffering, there's still an awful lot of hand waving there. If you don't want to die, probably your best bet is to sign up for cryonics. But yeah, a lot of transhumanists are focused on defeating aging and senescence and age-related disease, particularly associated with the work of Aubrey de Grey and also Cryonics, Max Moore, Cryonics Institute, Alcor. But there's a third strand of transhumanism, and this is what I've always really focused on, which argues that we can replace the biology of pain and suffering with life based on gradients of intelligent well-being. Information sensitivity is critical. That yes, it would be possible to wire up your reward circuitry such that you essentially enjoy indiscriminate bliss, that there would be strong selection pressure against wireheading. Most people, most parents are aghast at the idea. It's not going to happen like that. But based on existing freaks of nature, genetic outliers, people like my transhumanist colleague Anders Sandberg, who if pressed will say, quote, yes, I do have a ridiculously high hedonic set point. It is possible to ratchet up hedonic range and hedonic set point such that, yeah, an entire civilization is possible based on gradients of intelligent well-being. Now, I predict that I don't think it's morally urgent in the same way as getting rid of suffering is morally urgent, that, yeah, our descendants will enjoy life based on gradients of superhuman bliss. But yeah, I mean, that's speculative, and as I see it, the overriding moral urgency is to get rid of suffering, and it is possible to do this with recognizable extensions of existing technology this century. And that's counterintuitive, but I'm not invoking post-human superintelligence or singularity or anything like that. Gene editing, genome editing is now real. Synthetic gene drives are now potentially real. It's not going to happen, sadly, but if the World Health Organization were to launch a 100-year plan to phase out the biology of suffering, one can actually sketch out in relative detail what would actually be involved. As I say, this is not a prediction. It's going to take hundreds of years. Sadly, I think hundreds of years of suffering still lie ahead. But yeah, as a third strand to transhumanism, once again, this is a triple S civilization. This is a slogan. It's a simplistic summary. Most transhumanists are probably more focused either on super intelligence or super longevity. It's definitely a minority current, but yeah, phasing out the biology of involuntary suffering is, as I would see it, absolutely essential to becoming a post-human.
How did you come to antinatalism? Did something influence you, or was this like something that came through your negative utilitarianism or through the veganism? How did you come about this?
It's more of a label, just as I didn't become a transhumanist until someone said, hey, you're a transhumanist. I didn't become a self-diagnosed antinatalist until informed that this was my position. But yeah, from a very early age, I decided I didn't want to have children. I thought I would be bringing more suffering into the world. But yeah, it never occurred to me really that it could be anything more than a personal position. I was delighted when David Benatar published Better Never to Have Been. Kudos for Oxford University Press for doing so. I assumed that something like that would be unpublishable. And so, yeah, in spite of disagreeing with David Benatar's prescription and his extinctionism, nonetheless, yeah, I think he's done everyone a service. There's this kind of tension, because one isn't trying to make people depressed. On the contrary, one in some sense wants to accentuate the positive. It's more a case of would-be prospective parents that one's really wanting to remind just how dreadful life can be a lot of the time for a lot of people. So, yeah. But yeah, I suppose more recently I have used the label more often. But this distinction between being a soft and hard antinatalist, though it's not original to me, I can't actually recall where I first came across this distinction, is not widely known. One has to essentially define one's terms.
Yeah, it was more where did the not necessarily the label, but the idea that bringing a sentient being into existence would be a negative. Like you said, at an early age, this was.
Yeah, well, it's kind of teenager. In practice, this is it, you see. However much one thinks one is diagnosing the human predicament or the nature of reality, it's in many cases a form of oblique autobiography. And yeah, I was a troubled, depressive, introspective teen wrestling with the problem of suffering and how one could get rid of it. And yeah, the idea of creating more of it, yeah, would be abhorrent. I mean, having said that, just occasionally, I would have a normal response. Seeing a small child, oh, how sweet, how adorable, and even now, if I'm presented with some newborn by an adoring mother, I don't think, oh God, poor well, I might think it. I would not say, what is this poor Darwinian malware that you have brought into the world, but coo and make the appropriate noises. But yeah, I mean, as I said, the formal. Technically, I'm a negative utilitarian. I have been since my teens. It's a lousy brand. Buddhist, calling oneself a Buddhist sounds much better, only Buddhism has a lot of metaphysical accretions one probably wouldn't want to buy into. Also, I'm not convinced that it's desire and desire alone that is responsible for the world's suffering. The term suffering-focused ethics, I think, is probably the best one can do. But even so, of course, it sounds incredibly depressing. Perhaps the most useful tool I've found is, the Ursula Le Guin story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Now, though I think the little fable was designed, sorry, in case anyone listening hasn't come across this short story, this is the city of Omelas, this city of fabulous delights. Everyone in Omelas has an absolutely fabulous, wonderful time. And yet, for unexplained reasons, this wonderful city of delights depends on the torment of a single child locked away, abused in a basement. And the people of the city of Omelas know about this child, but in some sense they feel that this is a price worth paying. After all, compared to all the wonders of life, this is relatively trivial, a mere pinprick, one might say. However, there are some people, how many we don't know, who walk away from Omelas, who somehow find this obscene. And I think a lot of people who read the ones who walk away from Omelas, they feel that walking away is appropriate, and they certainly wouldn't be inclined to condemn other readers who say they would walk away from Omelas. Yet what does actually walking away from Omelas entail? And I would say, yes, it involves, not having children.
And does that apply to all sentient life, including non-humans?
Yes, this is one of the reasons that some forms of antinatalism, I don't really think fully address the problem, is that the probably most suffering in the living world isn't experienced by humans. I mean, humans, the amount of human suffering is obscene, but nonetheless, in spite of one's rather idyllic view of nature encouraged by Disneyfied wildlife documentaries. Life in a state of nature is mostly nasty, brutish, and short. Nature red in tooth and claw. Most non-human animals lead short, hungry, desperate existences. Probably, for the average, I can look outside the window and see a seagull. If you make it into adulthood, and most non-human animals in nature are probably not depressed. I mean, they don't self-mutilate as captive factory farmed non-humans tend to do, unless they're tailed up, debeaked, declawed, castrated, and so forth. But a lot of the living world is incredibly grim, and for the first time in history, we now have the ability to regulate the level of misery and malaise in nature. That the level of suffering in the world is now an adjustable parameter, and after we have outlawed factory farms and slaughterhouses, as I think we will as the culture meat revolution accelerates, I think we have a responsibility, the stewardship for nature. Now, personally, I wouldn't be sad if the whole monstrous apparatus of Darwinian life, pain-ridden, misery-ridden Darwinian life, was shut down. But this is not something that is sociologically credible. But this doesn't mean that we should just abandon free-living non-humans to their fate. There are powerful new technologies. In particular, I'm thinking of CRISPR-based synthetic gene drives, such that it's possible to remotely regulate the level of suffering or well-being of entire species, even at the price of a fitness cost to the individual. And if that sounds scientifically illiterate, that was my first response when I came across synthetic gene drives too. But I mean, synthetic gene drives cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance, and they can be used to push through what would otherwise be deleterious mutations. First of all, they're probably going to be used to defeat vector-borne disease like malaria. If you ensure all of a mosquito's offspring belong to the same gender, it's going to be possible to wipe out particular species of Anopheles mosquito, for example. I mean, there are obviously profound risks here too, but yes, essentially it's a tool for managing nature. Now, the idea, which hasn't been properly explored yet, of using synthetic gene drives to actually minimize free-living animal suffering probably sounds like sci-fi, but it's technically feasible, and unlike giving up meat, it doesn't actually involve any personal inconvenience to people. So, yeah, I mean, it's premature to talk about doing this kind of thing now. But if humans were to go extinct tomorrow, what would happen? There would be hundreds of millions of years of more pain, misery, and suffering. Whereas if we're prepared to assume responsibility, global stewardship of the biosphere, then within a few centuries, theoretically in a much shorter period, but let's say a few centuries, one can bring suffering under control and eventually eliminate it. I mean, every cubic meter of the planet is going to be computationally accessible to micromanagement and control. And if take something like obligate predators, for example. Now, intuitively, it's the ecosystem needs predation, because otherwise there would be an uncontrollable explosion of herbivores, leading to mass starvation and more misery. But once again, there are technical fixes. One can use some genetic tweaking to convert cats into herbivores with catnip flavored cultured meat as a kind of stopgap. One can use cross-species fertility regulation via immunocontraception tunable gene drives. Yeah, I mean, I go into more detail with some of these scenarios, not because I think that in 20 years' time they're going to be dusted down for use. It's more that only once people appreciate just what is and isn't technically possible can we have a serious ethical debate as to how much suffering we want in the living world. Do we want any suffering in the living world? Do we want to preserve existing species? And if so, are we obliged to maintain the sanctity of the germline, or are we allowed to tweak them? Any of your listeners who are thinking of, couldn't anything go wrong? I can think of thousands of things that can go wrong. But the point is, all sexual reproduction today, human or non-human, is a genetic experiment. And if we're going to either genetically experiment ourselves by having kids, or allow genetic experimentation to continue in nature, we're now in a position to, in a sense, assume responsibility for how much suffering we cause or allow to continue.
So wildlife would be included in your what's your project called again? The abolitionist
the abolitionist project. I mean, it's in one sense, it's Gautama Buddha. May all that hath life be delivered from suffering. I teach one thing only: suffering and the end of suffering. And I call this the abolitionist project. What's different isn't the kind of core ethic, but the fact that technology makes it possible now to draw up blueprints as to how it could be achieved, which, and this is controversial, I think are potentially, at least in future, might be sociologically realistic, because one can show, or at least tentatively show, how in the new reproductive era of designer babies, there's going to be selection pressure against genes predisposing to depression, pain-related disorders. I mean, after all, if you're not an antinatalist, you're determined to have kids, and you could actually choose the genetic dial settings, pain sensitivity, hedonic tone, hedonic range, hedonic set points. What dial settings would you choose? And other things being equal, most parents will want to have happy kids. Happy kids are more fun to raise. They're more likely to be successful. So yes, I think there is going to be selection pressure in favor of less suffering. In the case of non-humans, trying to, applying the abolitionist project to the rest of the living world at the moment would not really be computationally extraordinarily hard. It's sociologically unrealistic. But 50, 60, 70 years from now, I suspect it's eventually going to happen. One just sees the response of people in, let's say, a nature documentary. I mean, ask people in the abstract, do you think humans should intervene in nature or interfere? And most people will, of course, say no. But if they're watching David Attenborough documentary and so on, and the cameraman is filming, let's say, some starving baby elephant or something, viewers are most indignant if the cameraman keeps filming rather than actually offers assistance. Now, in practice, I said, such is the nature of our Disneyfied wildlife documentaries, that a lot of the really nasty stuff just simply isn't shown. But nonetheless, when some pathos-inducing scene is actually played out, most people, quite rightly, said, why allow the baby elephant to starve? And this level of surveillance, this kind of global panopticon, essentially, as I said, every cubic meter of the planet is going to be accessible to this level of surveillance. And of course, it could be used for terrible Orwellian purposes, or it could be used for a kind of pan-species welfare state. And I mean, clearly, I would very much favor the latter. Critics say, but this is turning the whole living world into a zoo. But I don't think that's really accurate. It's just as humans flourish best when we're neither wild nor incarcerated. This is the same with of non-human animals too. That yes, one wants basic provision of healthcare and so on, but light touch surveillance in tomorrow's wildlife parks, for example. Obviously, I'm glossing over all manner of technical, political, sociological challenges. If anyone thinks I'm being facile and glib, I can sympathise with that. But if someone says there is no alternative, I think one is entitled to say, well, yes, actually, there are alternatives.
Yeah, you have a lot of your theory in the hedonistic imperative. I was curious if will that ever become an actual physical book? Because it's really hard to read online with.
My good friend Magnus Winding did a Kindle. Essentially, the hedonistic imperative. Don't any antinatalist listeners don't be put off by the debauched title. This was back in 1995. I wrote this manifesto essentially urging and tentatively predicting that we get rid of the biology of suffering and replace it by life based on gradients of intelligent bliss. And I would have liked to have called it, the moral imperative to use biotechnology to get rid of suffering. Hedonistic imperative is a snappier title. But yeah, it was written, as I said, goodness heavens, 25 years ago now. And this was before the human genome had been decoded, cultured meat was just sci-fi. Essentially, it needs an update, not because I've radically changed my views, though back in 1995 I wasn't able to write about CRISPR-based synthetic gene drives, but it was also written, sort of for analytic philosophers. This was called 1995 was, the web was just beginning. No one had any real idea of its potential. And I realized that what I'd always assumed were completely unpublishable ideas, realizing that, hey, one can reach a wider audience. And halfway through the manifesto, realizing, well, I don't just need to write for analytic philosophers. I can write for a wider audience. But it's written in a rather kind of clotted academic style. And though I like to, since then I've done much, a lot of stuff I would hope is more readable. What is really needed is a rewrite, a good, accessible introduction to the abolitionist project. I said I wasn't the first. I now know that one, but to the best of my knowledge, only one writer, Louis Mancini, anticipated the idea of life based entirely on information sensitive gradients of well-being. Back in 1990, he wrote a little paper, Riley-Day syndrome in a world without pain. I mean, it's counterintuitive, the idea that it's possible to have intelligent, functional behavior without actual states of suffering. Yet, though it's technically challenging, it is actually feasible. Sorry, that's a long-winded response to your question,
okay.
But yes.
You still said there would be set points to put. Would it be the parents' responsibility to determine that? Who would determine those things?
Initially, it would be the parents, inevitably. Although, unlike pain sensitivity, there isn't a single, where one can actually point to a volume norm for pain sensitivity. One can't point to a single gene for hedonic set point. But nonetheless, there are a handful of genes, the FAR gene, the far out gene, the COMT gene, catecholomethyltransferase, number of other genes there, such that if one chooses benign settings, which in some cases would involve actual genetic engineering. In other cases would involve simply pre-implantation genetic screening. Then, yeah, initially it would be the responsibility of parents to choose for their, the approximate hedonic range and hedonic set point of their future baby. But as life, society evolves, it would be possible for the individual to choose these things, him or herself. I'm sorry, just in case any. I'm prone to use jargon. Apologies. This notion of hedonic set point. Seems each of us has roughly an approximate level of well-being or ill-being around which we tend to approximate in the course of a lifetime. But six months after either winning the lottery or having a terrible accident that leaves you quadriplegic, most people will revert to the approximate level of well-being or ill-being they had before the accident. Many complications. It's very counterintuitive. A lot of people would imagine, yes, if I won the national lottery, the solution to all my money worries, eureka. But yeah, natural selection has cleverly engineered things such that, yeah, most of the time we will regress towards this hedonic set point. But people have differing hedonic set points. Most people, it's probably a little bit above or a little bit low hedonic zero neutral experience. Surprisingly, and this came as a surprise to me, most people, their default hedonic set point is a little bit above of hedonic zero. Most people are not clinically depressed. A large minority are, but nonetheless, if you ask people right now, are you sad, very happy, or quite happy? On average, most people will actually say quite happy, which, in view of the amount of suffering in the world, yeah, it might seem surprising. But essentially, nature doesn't care. Nature plays around with the dial settings. Being depressed or depressive can have advantages, genetically speaking, so-called depressive realism. One can be more astute in one's judgment, but equally people who are full of a kind of life-loving vitality, optimists, people with high hedonic set points, they're, for example, more likely to go out, explore the world, sadly often do many unpleasant things. Traditionally, you know, the raping, looting, waging war, pillaging, all this kind of stuff, and leave more copies of their genes. So essentially there is this, there is a high genetic loading for hedonic set point. Sometimes it's relatively high by Darwinian standards, other times it's genetically low. And increasingly we're going to be able to choose this approximate hedonic set point. Now I'm sounding like a genetic determinist. I'm not. Genes and culture co-evolved, and I'm as keen on social economic reform as anyone else. But yeah, if we're serious about getting rid of suffering, we're going to have to tackle both the social and the biological genetic.
So when I was looking at the criticism, or at least people call it, like they do consider it a reductio of negative utilitarianism, the benevolent world exploiter thought experiment.
Mm-hmm.
On at least you were quoted as saying planning and implementing the extinction of all sentient life couldn't be undertaken painlessly. Even contemplating such an enterprise would provoke distress. Thus, a negative utilitarian is not compelled to argue for the apocalyptic solution. A lot of the positions that we hold ethically, say veganism or gene editing, causes distress in people. Like some people don't want this. So, is it just not practical to like, even as a thought experiment, as a challenge to NU? What would be your response to someone who says, well, wouldn't the reductio of NU be this benevolent world explorer thing.
Yeah, I mean, it appalls a lot of people, which is suggestive. But yeah, if there was simply a clean off button, initiate vacuum phase transition, no life, no suffering, effectively the end of the world. But there is no clean off switch, and indeed, yeah, this is the rather unfortunate thing about negative utilitarianism. Rather than conjuring up an image of care and compassion and concern for all sentient beings, it triggers these apocalyptic images. And indeed, simply because humans can't be trusted, if history shows us anything, is that, yeah, good intentions can go awry. I think one needs to enshrine in law something like the sanctity of life, even though I don't literally believe in the sanctity of life, not just human but non-human life, that otherwise one actually defeats one's purposes. I mean, let's assume that that you and everyone listening agrees that somehow we want to get rid of the awfulness of suffering. What is the most realistic, practical way we can do this safely in the minimum amount of time? And it's going to involve working with people, both secular and religious, who have value systems very different from ours. But fortunately, most different secular and religious belief systems do at least allow some weight to reducing suffering. And so I would hope that, any believer in suffering-focused ethics, can be thinking how we can form, strategic alliances with other groups, so that we can work to this common goal. Because even though most people aren't negative utilitarians and would give weight, at least some weight, to pleasure, in many cases to religious goals, and 1,001 other values too, nonetheless, potentially at any rate, I think we have a strong enough there's enough common ground for us to work to this goal of getting rid of involuntary suffering. It's worth stressing the involuntary, even though to me it's obvious that unfortunately a lot of critics have this idea that someone somewhere is going to force people to be happy against their will. But back to your original experiment, I'm sure a lot of your listeners, at least some of the time, would just think, if only we could just stop the horror. But sadly, there is no simple solution like that. We're going to have to go through this. It's going to take realistically hundreds of years. Mm-hmm.
On YouTube, someone asked, let's say the abolitionist project succeeds and that no pain remains in sentient beings through a myriad of technological advances. What about the future? What guarantees that there won't be any technological or technical failure that would let suffering come back?
Short answer is there's no guarantee, but nonetheless, if we are responsible, one can introduce multiple safeguards and AI, essentially AI as supervision. I mean, something like smallpox, for example. In theory, we could, or some malign agent could, reintroduce smallpox, bring it back to the world. But touch wood, other things being equal, once we wiped out smallpox, it's gone for good. And I think after we have phased out experience below hedonic zero, essentially, if we do it wisely and intelligently, we're going to introduce a whole bunch of safeguards to prevent anything like the Dark Ages from ever recurring. So once again, if in some sense it would be possible to, vacuum phase transition, no possibility of suffering or anything else ever occurring again, that would be a simple solution, but it it doesn't exist and it's not going to happen. Whereas if we work together for this goal, not merely of phasing out suffering, but ensuring it never occurs anywhere again within our Hubble volume, then yeah, I think that's probably the most we can hope for.
Even if a future devoid of pain is granted, in a negative utilitarian perspective, the abolitionist project seems suboptimal compared to the extinction of life as soon as possible, since waiting for the abolition of all forms of suffering entails accepting the appearance of suffering until the project's aims is attained. How does David Pearce view the abolitionist project as a better option than quick and painless life extinction?
I understand the intuition, but this is the problem. There is no painless life abolition that is sociologically realistic. I mean, yeah, technically one could envisage some kind of mega gigaton doomsday device, cobalt salted, that would sterilize the planet, or at least get rid of multicellular life. But essentially, no. It's not going to get built and it's not going to happen. And although various other scenarios are conceivable that I'm not going to go into, essentially the most likely result would be more suffering. I think it's much safer to, as I said, enshrine in law the sanctity of life and work with all well-meaning people worldwide to ensure that suffering is not merely abolished, but can never recur. And sure, knowledge that this will probably realistically take centuries, that its reproductive revolution will involve ensuring that all babies are designer babies. Yeah, I mean, the obstacles are utterly daunting and my heart sinks. Whereas, yeah, the idea of some simple off button or off switch, particularly if you're of a depressive cast of mind, is attractive. But essentially, it's not realistic, unfortunately.
A questioner asks, I'd be interested to challenge him on his objection to radical antinatalism on the basis of selection pressure. He makes the assumption that when an idea is genetically maladaptive, the selection pressure will weed it out. To me, it seems the evolution of thought is largely independent from biological evolution and only superficially mirrors it. It's not like people that decide to have kids genetically pass on their natalist beliefs or any other belief they might hold as a matter of fact to their offspring. Not that I'm particularly optimistic about the antinatalist project, but that has different reasons. And I think to characterize the position as inherently self-defeating is false. What do you think about that?
Of course, yeah, I'm profoundly sympathetic to the goals of antinatalism, given how much suffering that even a relatively fortunate child is likely to experience in the course of a lifetime. But essentially, evolution has bribed us with pleasure as well as pain. And though we have learned not to trust the judgment of heroin addicts, nonetheless, evolution bribes us all with endogenous opioids. And most people today, most potential mothers, for example, have a profound yearning urge to reproduce. Involuntary childlessness, as we know, causes tremendous heartache, suffering. One sees the extraordinary lengths people will go to have kids. There is simply, as you probably know, there is simply no way that rational, ethical argument can reach people who have this tremendous compulsion to breed and have kids, and it has once again a strong genetic loading. And yeah, the slightest predisposition to want to have as many kids as possible is amplified. Genes and culture, as we were saying earlier, kind of co-evolved, and it's no coincidence that that shall we say, the depressive, negative utilitarians, sort of like me, will not be actually passing on their genes to a new generation. So, yeah, as I said, this biblical injunction to go forth and multiply, it has variants in different religions across the world, and there is just simply no way that our arguments are going to be able to penetrate to most people, unfortunately.
Someone asks, time and money spent on transhumanism is time and money not spent on antinatalism. How do you balance the two?
I see them as complementary, because transhumanists would like, or at least many transhumanists would like, to see human extinction. They wouldn't put it like this. They would say that they would like us to become transhuman and then posthuman, to get rid of all the frailties of the body and flesh, to get rid of suffering, disease, and aging. And likewise, the reason most people, most antinatalists are antinatalists, is that not that giving birth is intrinsically bad, but rather giving birth is bad because one is bringing more suffering into the world. And yeah, this is it. If this is only a thought experiment, but imagine if we were to encounter an advanced civilization that had abolished any form of suffering, and that any new baby aliens were intrinsically, innately happy, that their lives were based on gradients of bliss. Would the hard antinatalist want to urge them not to have offspring, even though having offspring didn't involve suffering? And I would guess realistically that most well, I suppose some people would just dismiss this thought experiment, but yeah, I can essentially foresee an era in which there is no suffering, in which case antinatalism, as we understand it today, simply won't be relevant. Sadly, it's not imminent, but.
Yeah. Next question. My question is, transhumanism, as in working towards the betterment of human life, experience, evolving beyond its current physical and mental limitations, especially by means of science and technology, is and has been already happening. That's why, supposedly, we have the systems of economy, governance, medicine, application of science, and so forth. Whatever is happening is happening. What is transhumanism saying, or more so doing, beyond what is happening, done already, and will be done anyway, other than futuristic projections?
Yes, I mean, there is one sense in which, one can treat this kind of technological determinism, that sure, transhumanists are boosters for radical anti-aging research, but even though at the moment most people would accept the status quo and aging, if some miracle cure, anti-aging cure, were to be developed and hit the stores, essentially all people's resistance would rapidly be swept away. But in the case of, although I think transhumanist technologies of intelligence augmentation and radical anti-aging probably happen anyway, sadly at the moment most technical focus is not on improving mood, well-being, pain sensitivity. As I said, we're just at the very start of the reproductive revolution of designer babies, and most people are focusing on the issues of is it right or wrong to engineer babies who don't have genetic disease, that's remediation, or are augmented. And I think there is an important role for transhumanists in the broad sense, whether or not one calls oneself a transhumanist or not, to say that if people insist on having kids, that they have a responsibility to minimize the amount of pain and suffering they bring into the world. And yeah, so I mean, I'm sorry, I don't want to repeat myself, but yeah.
Another question. I know he has commented he is an ethicist. Have you actually commented that?
I think obliquely by saying that if, you know, I would press, if there really were just a clean off button, I would actually press it.
Okay, because yeah, it goes on
that
to
is,
say, I would like to know what he means by that, and if he could elaborate. So,
yeah, although it makes me uncomfortable because I think it's a distraction, yes, I would personally press the off button. I think there is obscene suffering in the world, and if it were possible cleanly to eliminate it, and this was the only way to do it, I would press it. So in that sense, I would be an ethicist. However, I'm not an ethicist in the sense that I think we should be working for the destruction of all life, because I think it is not merely infeasible, I think it is counterproductive, it will make enemies, and it will lead to more suffering. So yeah, I would, that is it. I, in spite of being a negative utilitarian, I wouldn't use the ethicist label. I mean, other people might decide to apply it, and indeed, in practice, I think the need to be tremendous safeguards. I mean, something like euthanasia, for example. I mean, if one is a doctor, a compassionate doctor, I'm sure a lot of doctors will think, oh God, this poor suffering person, wouldn't it be better if she were out of her misery? And yet it would be profoundly dangerous if doctors went around discreetly bumping off their patients playing God. So yeah, I'm aware of the fact that it does sound a tension between being a negative utilitarian and saying one should have ignored the sanctity of life, but there's less tension than one might imagine.
Next question, what is the biggest existential threat facing humanity in your opinion?
Well, in spite of the great plague that is upon us, I don't, essentially humanity is going to survive this little drama. Realistically, I think humans are going to become extinct in the next few centuries, but not in some apocalyptic event, though sadly I consider some form of nuclear war quite likely. Essentially, we are going to rewrite our own source code. That it's going to be a combination of AI, essentially with a little sort of neurochip or a implant. You can have super intelligence integrated within you, or narrow AI, together with this ability, starting off with little light genetic tweaking, but eventually wholesale genetic rewrite. Essentially, we are going to cease to be human in a recognizable sense. So I don't think there's going to be, a specific cutoff where we cease to be Homo sapiens. But if one were to flash forward 1,000 years, let's say, I don't think there would be any archaic humans around. Indeed, it would probably be grossly unethical to conserve sort of brain damaged and dysfunctional Darwinian life forms. This isn't admittedly what the term existential risk is sometimes used to mean, but that's why I think we're going to become extinct in the next few centuries.
What is your opinion of Aubrey de Grey and his work on trying to defeat aging?
Well, I have tremendous respect for Aubrey de Grey. He's single-handed, more than anyone else, he has rescued radical anti-aging research from Crank Alley. And I'd recommend reading Ending Aging. I suspect Aubrey is more optimistic about timescales than the evidence warrants. But this is it: the unknown unknowns, revolutionary breakthroughs. Aging is going to be fixable. What else can I say? Yeah, I wish, in some sense, there were closer collaboration between Sen's and the cryonics movement. In that, there is something almost cruel about promising people, yeah, science is going to find a cure for aging shortly, probably shortly after you're dead. Um, I can quite imagine that many of your listeners don't find the idea of radical extension, radical life extension, especially appealing. But nonetheless, yeah, compared to the challenges of getting rid of, defeating aging, it's much easier to defeat the biology of suffering and even the biology of boredom. And so, I would see it's quite tightly intermeshed there. But one shouldn't imagine that indefinite lifespans mean indefinite suffering. On the contrary.
Are you signed up for cryogenics? Oh, sorry, cryonics. Are you signed up
Cryonics.
for cryonics?
I did almost complete the process, but if I go down that route, it would be more likely to be cryo-euthanasia. I'm personally skeptical that cryonics, if you wait 6-8 hours or whatnot, that I suspect irretrievable information loss will occur. If you do it at the age of 95 or whatnot, in what sense are you still the same person you are at the age of 60 or 30? I confess I'm very ambivalent here in that I don't think post-human superintelligence would consider it ethical to reanimate brain-damaged Darwinians from a previous era. I mean, sure, they could get rid of whatever killed us, and they could massively upgrade us emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, if you like to. But in which case, why bother? Why bother to have yourself suspended if you don't think it's going to be you who wakes up? But part of the reason for doing this is, as I said, I feel I would be hypocritical not to do so. If I urge, as I do, opt out cryonics option for everyone as a way of defanging death, I feel it would be hypocritical for me not to do the same myself. But yeah, if I do go down this route, it would probably be cryo-euthanasia. I mean, the thought of sinking into decrepitude, not so much the physical as the intellectual decrepitude, does not appeal to me. No.
How do you feel about the right to die? What restrictions, if any, should be in place for those seeking euthanasia?
Ooh, heavens. Essentially, I don't think anyone should be forced to live who doesn't want to. But what is absolutely critical is to have massive safeguards. And one doesn't want older people feeling that they are in some sense obliged to die, because otherwise they'll be eating into their children's inheritance. The issue of cost shouldn't even be raised. I would hope, though, that as we actually understand more about our reward circuitry, essentially how to get rid of any form of pain and suffering, that no one will want to die. I suspect, in spite of calling myself, my kind of antinatalist, negative utilitarian, I wouldn't be surprised if our successors regard this as some kind of depressive psychosis. So I'm dodging the question, but by not actually spelling out in detail what the safeguards need to be. Another reason there need to be safeguards, of course, it's not simply an individual who is impacted, but their family too. How much in the way of delays and bureaucracy should there be? because, yeah, many people today, at least spontaneously at some stage, even people who think of themselves as temperamentally optimistic, will have moments when they would like to kill themselves, self-harm, and so forth. What level of safeguards are optimal? And it's messy.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
The short-term, medium-term future, pretty pessimistic. I'm moderately confident that this century we're going to get rid of the horrors of factory farming and slaughterhouses in virtue of the development of cultured meat. So in that sense, you could say I'm optimistic. But this century, I also foresee, sadly, that there's probably going to be nuclear war, all manner of horrors, unknown unknowns. I'll be honest, this current Great Plague, whatever, COVID-19, yeah, this took me by surprise. I knew it was possible in the abstract, but yeah, it doesn't seem real what's happening now. And so, yeah, I foresee later this century all manner of pain and suffering. But if one looks further ahead, how far ahead, I don't know. I would like to say 100 to 150 years, realistically, 300, 400, 500 years, I suppose I would count as an optimist. I said for technical reasons, I think a combination of the pleasure principle and biotechnology means that first we're going to get rid of suffering. And rather than thinking, well, our ethical duties have all been discharged, now we can relax, in practice, essentially, we're going to go on ratcheting up hedonic range, hedonic set points, live lives of indescribable bliss, far richer than today's peak experiences. And so, yeah, this, I suppose, would make me sound like an incredible optimist. I still have an incredibly dark conception of reality. I'm still a button-pressing negative utilitarian. But yeah, for purely technical reasons, I think heaven lies ahead of us.
How much of an obligation do we have to relieve non-human suffering in nature? This goes on to say, if aliens were to visit this planet, do you think that they would have any moral obligation to help Earthlings and relieve their suffering? If humans in the far future ever develop the ability to travel space, would we have an obligation to help suffering on other planets?
Yes, is the short answer. I mean, I did briefly in Hedonistic Imperative discuss the possibility of cosmic rescue missions. I suspect, touchwood, that we are alone, at least within our Hubble volume, our cosmological horizon, and that, therefore cosmic rescue missions will not be needed. In one's darker moments, one thinks humans are in any case more likely to spread suffering across the galaxy and beyond than relieve it. But assuming that we do get rid of suffering on Earth, by that stage too, we'll have probably a better idea of whether it is likely Darwinian ecosystems have evolved elsewhere. And if they do exist within our galaxy, yes, I think we have an obligation to send out probes and remedy them. This, of course, is the opposite of the prime directive of Star Trek. I mean, what would a notional post-human superintelligence do with a planet like Earth? I don't think post-human superintelligence would suffer from status quo bias, so they might think that we would all be best retired. But given that there is no, as far as we know, no post-human superintelligence, we essentially have got to become that superintelligence and assume responsibility, cosmic stewardship for the rest of the galaxy, indeed the universe within our cosmological horizon. in practice, that may turn out to be too grandiose. There are incredible obstacles to reaching other solar systems, and if you think they're likely to be lifeless lumps of rock or gas, then yes, the attraction may pall. But we don't know this yet, and if there really are suffering life forms elsewhere in our galaxy, then yeah, I think we will have an obligation to help them.
What do you think antinatalists fail to see? What is your critique of it?
I'm guessing the questioner is thinking of hard antinatalism, and yeah, this is just back to the argument from selection pressure. It's I mean, this is it. So often one feels if one has a strong either intellectual or ethical argument, one makes it ought to be luminously self-evident, and the rest of the world ought to fall in behind one. But the world doesn't work like that, and yeah, I fear most antinatalists underestimate, downplay, or don't consider the nature of selection pressure. And that's, yeah, I certainly wouldn't wish to discourage antinatalists from urging everyone to remain child-free. But what does one say to people who are determined to have kids? I think one should combine antinatalism with urging people to be responsible, planned parenthood, loading the genetic dice. Okay, right now it sounds far out, but as we know from the first CRISPR babies, essentially they are coming. I can't obviously precisely time the reproductive revolution, but many and probably most people would think it is, it is defensible to get rid of or prevent cystic fibrosis and other nasty genetic diseases. And I would hope that antinatalists, while maintaining their principles, would play a role in helping prospective parents to live up to their obligations. I mean, expressing our disagreement with their decision to have kids, but nonetheless not just simply giving up there.
Why is he a negative utilitarian?
As distinct from some other position. I mean, there is something self-intimatingly awful and ghastly about suffering. It's if one is in that state, and it's primitive. I couldn't explain to someone who had never suffered why suffering is so awful and dreadful. But yeah, anyone who is in that state just knows it is awful. By contrast, if someone who is already happy, or if there is inert matter and energy, there is no self-intimating justification to converting this inert matter and energy into pure bliss, or helping the person who is already contented become superhumanly happy. I mean, I'm very relaxed about the possibility of doing so. Indeed, I think it's going to happen, that the future does lie in gradients of superhuman bliss. But there is this asymmetry, basic asymmetry there, ethical asymmetry, that suffering is intrinsically bad. There's something intrinsically wrong with it. Now, okay, just because there is something intrinsically self-intimatingly wrong with my agony and despair, what bearing does this have on the suffering of others? I mean, the anti-realist might say, well, that's just your personal opinion. To which I would respond that, okay, I can't access your agony and despair, but it's an epistemological limitation on my part. It's not a deep metaphysical truth about the world. And if I could access your despair and agony, or for that matter of any other sentient being, I would appreciate why it is self-intimatingly bad and why I should help. and that a notional post-human superintelligence that could, rather fancifully, notionally, impartially access all first-person perspectives, that superintelligence would, so to speak, collectively withdraw our hand from the fire. But yeah, once we have got rid of any form of experience below hedonic zero, I think our ethical duties will have been discharged. But then essentially, yeah, the world, the universe is our oyster. It will be possible to do all manner of fantastic things. But I think the realm of morality belongs to Darwinian life, pain and suffering, and our obligation to get rid of it.
Would it be a bad or sad thing if there were no humans or sentient beings in the universe?
Personally, I don't think so. There was nothing wrong with the universe 10 billion years ago. However, today, a lot of people do find the idea of getting rid of, their most precious experiences and so on. They value, want to preserve, perpetuate, and extend them. And because as a negative utilitarian, one wants to eradicate even the faintest hint of disappointment, I think one is entitled to say, as a negative utilitarian, that one favors the creation of life based on gradients of bliss, a future that is far more magical than that most people can even conceive. And one is entitled to say this in virtue of being a negative utilitarian, because negative utilitarians want to get rid of any form of unpleasant experience, including disappointment and frustration.
What do you think is the strongest argument for antinatalism?
Well, essentially, by having offspring, one is bringing creatures into the world without their consent. And if it were the case that one were bringing life into the world that was incapable of suffering, as may one day be the case, I wouldn't have a problem. But the fact is, when one has a child today, that child is, in the course of a lifetime, at some stage, going to undergo incredible suffering. And I don't consider this kind of genetic experiment to be ethically justified.
Norwegian-Canadian philosopher Herman Tønnesen, who is transhumanist and antinatalist, said, quote, "If we can't genetically fix our nature, I agree with Zaf. To leave world to a deserted behind is better than to continue this grotesque carousel of procreation." End quote. Do you agree with this? Should these things go hand in hand? Rejection of procreation as long as the transhumanist project is not implemented. In other words, given the current human situation, are you not only transhumanist, but also antinatalist like Tønnesen?
Yes, I mean, I'm an antinatalist. I couldn't possibly justify bringing more suffering into the world. The problem is, of course, that most people will ignore the antinatalist arguments for evolutionary reasons. Most people are determined to breed, to have children, that nature doesn't merely inflict suffering upon us, it also bribes us with pleasure, quite literally with endogenous opioids. Now, by common consent, the judgment of heroin addicts can't be trusted, but each of us has an endogenous opioid system, and yeah, nature has bribed us, and consequently being involuntarily childless causes tremendous suffering too. Many people will go to quite extraordinary lengths to have children, and so though I would personally urge people not to bring more suffering into the world, I also accept that strong, hard antinatalism is not going to solve the problem of suffering. So, yes, as a transhumanist, I urge biological genetic solutions, which, unlike strong antinatalism, aren't vulnerable to the argument from selection pressure.
Do you not consider that maybe such experiments on humans as genome rewiring attempts will only worsen the human situation? We do not know what it'll really look like. On the one hand, created humans may feel even more objectified and manipulated because of this, as custom-made items with more and more specific features, still created not for their own sake, but for the pleasure of their creators, for their optimistic visions, another innocent victim sacrificed to another utopian god. On the other hand, immortality may seem desirable, but could also cause indescribable suffering. For example, it may be a punishment of an infinite prison in a cramped cell without the possibility of suicide. Which dictator would not be delighted with such possibility of punishing his enemies? If genome modification will be possible, it will be possible to modify it not only to feel less pain and more pleasure, but also to feel more pain and less pleasure. New tortures, more intense than anything we know. This seems to be a great potential method of controlling societies. Similar objections have Professor John Gray in his Straw Dogs, Thoughts on Humans and Other Animals. Quote, if anything about the present century is certain, it is that the power conferred on humanity by new technologies will be used to commit atrocious crimes against it. If it becomes possible to clone human beings, soldiers will be bred in whom normal human emotions are stunted or absent. Genetic engineering may enable old age diseases to be eradicated. At the same time, it is likely to be technology of choice in future genocides. Those who ignore the destructive potential of new technologies can do so only because they ignore history. Pogroms are as old as Christendom, but without railways, the telegraph, and poison gas, there would have been no Holocaust. There have always been tyrannies, but without modern means of transport and communication, Stalin and Mao could not have built their gulags. Humanity's worst crimes were made possible only by modern technology. End quote. Do you have no doubt that playing God, even bigger than it was in the case of ordinary procreation, can bring even more terrible results? It is said that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and our history, human history, teaches us that, indeed, is often so. Good intentions and progress often bring hell. John Gray mentions the Holocaust and gulags, but there is also, for example, industrial farming. Thanks to good intentions and progress, we often even surpass nature itself in cruelty and causing suffering.
Ooh, a lot of material, a lot of good points there, and I can't pretend to do them justice. Okay, starting though right at the beginning, let's assume that we decide that we, as a society, we want to create first, shall we say, low pain babies, and then eventually a no pain civilization. And let's assume, and this is a very big assumption, that someone like Jo Cameron, with her unique double mutation, she's this 72-year-old retired vegan Scottish school teacher. She never gets depressed or anxious, but she's socially responsible. She's sensible enough to avoid noxious stimuli. Sometimes she's had problems because of this. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go gung-ho to replicate her unique double mutation, but let's say cautiously we decide to create for prospective parents who are determined to have kids. Let's say we do decide that it's ethically appropriate to have kids with very high pain thresholds, high hedonic set points, so that their offspring will not undergo the worst forms of suffering that so many people undergo today. Yeah, I mean, I can see horrendous pitfalls, ethical dilemmas, things that can go wrong and so forth, but it's the question of weighing risk-reward ratios. And given that most people essentially are determined to have children, and they're not going to listen to antinatalists, I think what we ought to be doing is aiming to help them load the genetic dice in favor of their future offspring. So okay, yeah, I mean that's the first part of the objection stroke question, as I understand it. The second part, yeah, how could these technologies be abused? I mean, yes, I'm worried about S risk. The worst form of S risk, as I can see it, is that in theory, a deep understanding of the molecular pathways of pain and suffering could be used to create more suffering, not get rid of it altogether. So yes, one has to, take desperately seriously all the ways new technologies can be abused. But yeah, I mean, life on Earth past 540 million plus years has been pain, misery, and suffering, together with intermittent good bits, but essentially unspeakable suffering. And so we've essentially got got a choice what to do about it without biological genetic interventions, together, of course, with a massive social revolution. Pain and suffering will continue indefinitely. That practicing individually antinatalism may be right, but it's not going to get rid of the biology of suffering. So as I see it, well, if I had my way, essentially one will be seeing a kind of 100-year plan under the auspices of something like of the World Health Organization to phase out the biology of suffering, which would be multi-stranded, ranging from the fairly obvious, like getting rid of factory farming and slaughterhouses, to the less obvious in terms of the reproductive revolution of designer babies, synthetic gene drives used to mitigate and then eradicate suffering throughout the biosphere. Tremendous technical challenges, but they can be defeated. But but in immense political, sociological changes challenges too. And yeah, sure, I can think of so many things that can go wrong, but I mean, this is it. It's sweeping generalization. Most people may be callous and self-centered, but we're not, on the whole, systematically malicious or malevolent. Essentially, trying to get rid of suffering throughout the living world now would be, it couldn't be done now. It will be feasible later this century. But if the actual personal inconvenience is minimal, I think most people will go along with it and support it. I mean, that might be unduly optimistic, but take something like anesthesia for surgery. And when it was first introduced, not many people know this, but essentially there was vigorous opposition from some traditional religious people that this was against the Bible. Women were sort of destined to suffer in childbirth, but nonetheless, essentially it swept the globe, and now essentially surgical anesthesia is the norm, and we're not going to go back to surgery without anesthesia. Or something like getting rid of smallpox. Yes, it's possible that smallpox or something like smallpox could be used as a weapon of war in future, but nonetheless, essentially, there was a global consensus that it's a frightful disease and we should get rid of it. And now smallpox is extinct. In terms of you must help me. I'm not sure I've covered all the points. In terms of creating fearless super soldiers, in practice, any wars of the future are more likely to be conducted with robots and AI than traditional biological robots, soldiers. Of course, like so many people, I would hope that we are going to phase out war. I mean, which is probably utopian for the foreseeable future, but just as the development of the nation state, which claims a monopoly of the use of violence, I would anticipate that eventually something like the UN, hopefully democratically elected, will assume a kind of monopoly of the use of force, essentially. Sort of universal application of the rule of law. I mean, I can imagine your, listeners, many of them thinking, well, this is just incredibly utopian and optimistic. And I'm not. Unfortunately, I foresee centuries more of pain, misery, suffering, anxiety disorders, depression, suicide. I mean, you name it. But insofar as we are morally serious about getting rid of suffering, this is the only approach, the only way I know to go forward, some kind of biohappiness revolution. That it's quite extraordinary power. It does give us mastery of our own genetic source code, the ability to reprogram the biosphere. And if so-called soft antinatalists, believers in suffering-focused ethics, essentially work together with religious, secular ethicists, the broader community, then it will be possible to get rid of suffering. As I said, in spite of being an uber pessimist by temperament, for technical reasons, I think a combination of the pleasure principle and modern biotechnology is going to lead, to a biosphere without suffering. Indeed, probably life based on gradients of intelligent bliss. And by focusing on, building political alliances, essentially one can take the project forward of getting rid of suffering. Whereas, and I'm sure you and I'm sure quite a few of your listeners, if one says something like, "Oh, it would have been better if we'd never existed," that if only there were an off switch, and so on. And I've obviously had these thoughts too. One will alienate potential allies and supporters, because, of course, it's not just radical antinatalists who think suffering is terrible. I mean, most of the religious tradition, most secular ethical traditions give some weight, and usually a lot of weight, to getting rid of suffering, but they also have other values too. And so, although I'm not personally, sadly, a political activist or movement builder, if I were, this would be the direction I would be urging. That antinatalists, we believers in suffering-focused ethics, we need as many allies as possible. And it's also good to be, to mug up on the science, to become scientifically literate and understand what is and isn't possible.
So one of the questions is, how do you feel about the war on drugs? What is the best policy to relieve the suffering of those who are addicted to drugs?
Yes, so my instincts are libertarian. There are complications. That's not be only happy if, let's say, unrestricted use of antibiotics, for example, which actually harms others. Nonetheless, rather than focusing on prohibition, I think medicine science ought to be focused on devising safe recreational euphoriants. Something like coffee, for example, it's a mind-altering drug, but essentially one carefully calibrates the amount of coffee one wants to take. In terms of recreational drugs, sadly, what most of them do is they tend to kick into gear the negative feedback mechanisms of the brain. In some cases, users discover that the drugs are making them unhappy and stop. But in other cases, something like opioids, it's too late, and the user is actually essentially going to be dependent indefinitely. But so I mean, I could, as you know, whole books have been written on the drug war, and I could repeat a lot of platitudes, but I think it should be regarded as a medical rather than a legal issue. But having said that, of course, someone, let's say, has an opioid habit and is reduced to stealing to gain resources to fund it, and this is profoundly undesirable.
Is it moral to introduce modern Western technology to tribal peoples to relieve their suffering, or is it better to just leave them alone?
I think one essentially has an obligation to help. I mean, this is it. If one encountered a tribe of cannibals, one wouldn't feel that, one has a duty to allow them to continue to practice cannibalism. In that sense, one would be imposing our values. But in the case of, let's use a less exotic example. Imagine some primitive, undiscovered tribe, though there probably aren't any more of those anymore. Essentially, assuming that they are typical humans, they will suffer pain, depression, disease, anxiety, all manner of illness and infirmity, and some of these will already be curable with modern medicine. In future, all of them will be. Essentially, compared to our successors, humans today are akin to toddlers who harm themselves. And I think, though it sounds paternalism, the reason we should be suspicious of paternalism today is the suspicion that those who would want to, in a sense, tell us what to do or instruct us or look after us wouldn't solely have our interests at heart. But though I suppose, this does sound patronizing, but in an important sense, we know what primitive pre-scientific tribes don't, how to cure all manner of nasty diseases, for example. So I think we do have an obligation to intervene.
Okay. Are you a materialist, idealist, panpsychist? Does your metaphysical worldview influence your ethics? If so, in what way?
Tentatively, I'm both a realist and a physicalist, but I'm also very tentatively an idealist. Now, that probably sounds like schizophrenic word salad. I think the world is exhaustively described by the equations of physics, but materialism can't solve the hard problem. It's inconsistent with the entirety of the empirical evidence, i.e. one's own consciousness. So yes, I would struggle to defend materialism to close the explanatory gap, whereas I do take seriously this possibility, the so-called intrinsic nature argument, that experience discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical, and non-materialist physicalism has tremendous explanatory, predictive power, and it's also empirically adequate. Once again, that is a tentative view. It's the so-called intrinsic nature argument has enjoyed a modest revival in recent years, but it's not necessary for any listener to buy into my, shall we say, somewhat unusual, idiosyncratic metaphysical views to think that it would be great if we got rid of suffering. Has this position influenced my ethical views? Not as much as you might imagine. No. Idealism, even physicalistic idealism, non-materialist physicalism of the kind I was outlining just then, might be associated with many people with fluffiness or mysticism or some kind of rosy cosmic view of things, but no, it's simply a way to close the explanatory gap and solve the so-called hard problem.
I was curious about your views on antinatalism advocacy, because I think you have a couple of websites on antinatalism now, and I was wondering, like, where do you see the movement going, or should be going? What would you like to see in terms of what we're doing in this community?
Well, yeah, a friend at one stage was thinking of actually, launching a kind of World Antinatalist Association. I think this project is currently on hold. Essentially thinking about all the pain, suffering, and misery in the world, urging antinatalism. It can take a real toll on on one's mental health. And I think antinatalists in general have an obligation to take care of their own mental health, because that way they can generally do more good helping others. As I said, though I am personally an antinatalist, a soft antinatalist, I haven't got, a clear strategy for the antinatalist movement as a whole, beyond working with other groups, organizations, effective altruists, transhumanists, the wider community, in working on tools to minimize suffering. Yes, very, very important, not, if possible, bringing new life into the world. If you really want kids, adopt rather than have biological kids yourself. But essentially, recognize, why are we antinatalists? Because we want to reduce, to prevent, to mitigate suffering. And I would like to see the antinatalist movement building as many bridges as possible, also taking responsibility for the mental health of its own members, because one can do more good if one is basically happy oneself, and by constantly focusing on, accurately, I feel, on just how awful life is for so many beings, that it can make one even more miserable and unhappy. There's this kind of optimal balance to strike, and I don't know, I won't pretend I've got the right balance.
Do you have any tips or advice for people that are in trying to focus on the suffering focused ethics? And I feel like burnout would be common for this type of thing. As you said, it takes a large emotional load on a person. Is there anything that you do personally, or that you could advise others on, so they don't burn out on this kind of thing?
Partly just in terms of general health, this trinity of optimal nutrition, good sleep, good sleep discipline, and aerobic exercise, strong social bonds, exploring, if need be, if one is personally depressed or has loved ones or close friends who are depressed, the different options. Antidepressants they sound depressing, but nonetheless they do help some people. But any particular tips? No, essentially, for the past 25 years or so, I've been, plugging away, trying to fly the flag for this particular strand of transhumanism, hoping that essentially this current doesn't, as I said, far more transhumanists are focused on radical life extension and superintelligence, wanting to essentially keep I would see it as absolutely central, the biohappiness, the case for a biohappiness revolution. But have I got any tips for individual listeners? it's a case of recognizing one's own strengths and weaknesses, not beating oneself up about one's own limitations. But just I'm sorry I'm repeating myself, but the actual obligation to take care of oneself. No one wouldn't say this to to Donald Trump that he ought to be kinder on himself or something, but I can all antinatalists in some sense I would say have got an obligation to try to look after their own well-being. If they're doing something that is making them unhappy or depressed, if possible they should stop. That they'll be actually able to help more people for longer if they actually feel relatively well.
Right. Yeah.
Even if this involves an element of escapism.
Yeah, I agree. Is there anything that you'd like to, now that we're coming to a close, is there anything else you'd like to add before we end?
No, I just really wanted to say thank you, Mark, for the work you're doing. Thank you for inviting me on. Sorry if I haven't properly answered any of the questions put by your listeners. I'm aware of the fact that sometimes I must have caused some of them frustration, but I'm not the kind of transhumanist that is totally kind of gung-ho about technology, I promise, and that I have a profound sympathy and admiration for antinatalists and the antinatalist movement, and my reservations, such as they are, tend to be technical rather than ethical. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you very much for coming on. It's been great. And I want to thank everybody from the antinatalist community for submitting questions, and hope you have a relatively great day. Thank you everyone for listening. The next episode will be a discussion with the YouTuber Dana Wells, the Friendly Antinatalist. If you have any questions for the Friendly Antinatalist that you would like asked on the show, you can contact the Exploring Antinatalism Team on social media via Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or email at exploringantinatalism@gmail.com. Take care, everybody.